Communism is kind of a fun buzzword that we can use to sort of sensationalize our general discussions of left-wing ideologies and political movements. And in this case, we are going to talk about India. More specifically, what these left-wing organizations and ideologies meant for India's independence movement, as well as contextualizing all of that in the frame of Britain's global history. So let's get started. Like most things, radicalism in India can be traced back to none other than the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Fletcher. And really, this was the foundational text for the thinkers and intellectuals and activists who were the founding members of the major socialist and communist organizations and parties that began populating the Indian political landscape. And really, this text, in conjunction with the frenzy of the October Revolution, Leninism, and the Great Soviet Experiment, were the fodder for a new kind of momentum that allowed these left-wing organizations to emerge as major forces to reckon with. But there is kind of this uniqueness in India because much of the literature on the subject argues that really what drew the members of the Indian populace to these left-wing organizations and these left-wing entities was the collapse of Gandhi's non-cooperation movement in 1922, which really encouraged a lot of people to question the efficacy of civil disobedience and nonviolence in the fight for independence. So let's take a step back for a second and talk about the beginnings of radicalism in India. And really, there is no better place to start than with M.N. Roy. Really, no conversation about left-wing politics in India can be had without talking about Roy. Roy first developed an interest in Marxism during his time in the United States, and he was credited with starting the first communist party outside of Russia in 1919. And interestingly enough, that party was in Mexico, of all places. But quickly, Roy became a close ally of Vladimir Lenin and was tasked with preparing India for revolution. So in 1920, Roy established the Communist Party of India, which envisioned a, quote, Indian revolution originating from the workers and peasants on the Russian model, end quote. Roy's Communist Party of India worked alongside Comintern, which was the international organization in Moscow that advocated for worldwide communism. And according to Roy, this would, quote, organize the masses for the end of the class struggle and British imperialism, as well as destroy European capitalism, end quote. Roy published all kinds of writing on radicalism, left-wing political thought, and how it would all help define an independent India's future. And these writings would not only allow him to emerge as a leading and authoritative voice in Indian politics, but these writings would also influence many young independence activists. And some of those activists included the likes of Jayaprakash Narayan and Jawaharlal Nehru. Narayan and Nehru first met as young men in 1929, shortly after Nehru's visit to the Soviet Union. And Nehru is described to have been deeply impressed by the rapid transformation that had taken place under communism, so naturally he and Narayan hit it off immediately. However, while the two of them were both members of the Indian National Congress and had a strong personal relationship with one another, the line that kind of split them was Gandhiism. Socialism, Narayan argued, is a system of social reconstruction. It's not a code for personal conduct. It is not something you and I can practice, nor is it a hothouse growth. When we speak of applying socialism to India, we mean the reorganization of the social life of the country, its farms, factories, schools, theaters. Gandhiism, he argued, served as a cloak for reactionism and conservatism, and even large-scale theft and violence. This isn't to say that there was hostility between Gandhi and Narayan. On the contrary, the two of them exhibited great admiration and respect for one another, but really Narayan's critique circles back to the failure of the non-cooperation movement and why socialism emerged in India in the first place. Gandhiism, in his opinion, wasn't doing enough. It was sort of this bourgeois movement that made rich people feel good about themselves and garnered all kinds of support and donations from the wealthy. It was very much out of touch with working class people, and it wasn't threatening the system, it wasn't shaking the earth, and it wasn't doing what it needed to, especially when it came to land tenure and distribution policy in agrarian sectors and industrialization in urban sectors. So, in 1934, Narayan and a few other members of the Indian National Congress split from the party and started the Congress Socialist Party. So, by 1934, we have, broadly, the Communist Party associated with Roy, and the Socialist Party associated with Narayan. And this leads us to our next question. What did those parties accomplish? I think it's kind of difficult to distinguish the individual accomplishments of each party because in this period of time, there was so much movement and fluidity and party splitting, but I think it's fair to conclude that the activities of the Communist Party of India were very much instrumental in mobilizing students, young people, agrarian peasants, and urban laborers. And their efforts were kind of ragtag, but they were very much effective in initiating strikes of factories and public works, of organizing peasant revolts, as well as establishing labor and trade unions. And also very important was that the communists were the staunchest advocates for the Constituent Assembly in the Indian Constitution. And very early on, they argued that, quote, the right of framing the Constitution is the sovereign right of the Indian people, and the supreme authority which should promulgate the Constitution of India is the National Constituent Assembly. Meanwhile, the Socialist Party and Jayaprakash Narayan specifically have this crowning achievement of the Quit India movement of 1942. And at the start of this movement, some of the key figures in the independence movement, like Gandhi and Nehru, were arrested and in prisons and very far from the public eye. So it was the revolutionaries and the Congress Socialist Party that led these underground campaigns that powered the movement forward. And very much in character, did not at all adhere to the principles of Gandhiism and kind of led these more militant, aggressive, and violent upheavals during the movement. Really, the point I'm trying to make is that the left-wing organizers during the independence movement were incredibly powerful and influential entities. And while these organizations and actors were very powerful, they were also very far from perfect. And these organizations suffered from all kinds of structural weaknesses that impeded their abilities to exercise the influence and the authority that they'd hoped to. And really, I argue that these problems boil down to two major issues. One, party infighting and splitting, and two, inconsistent and unstable leadership. So, in discussing the downfall of these organizations, that ultimately leads us to the question, what does this left-wing activity in India reveal to us about Britain's global history? Right off the bat, the Communist Party of India hated Gandhi, they hated Nehru, and they hated the Indian National Congress with a burning passion because ideologically they believed that the two of them were fundamentally different. They accused Gandhi of being pro-British and, quote, an unwitting tool of the old guard, while they regarded Nehru as, quote, a thoughtless, vain, egocentric, popularity-hunting demagogue who was trying to bamboozle a mass of workers and keep the masses within the framework of the British imperial constitution and legislation, faithfully carrying out the instructions of landlords and capitalists. So, the communists reluctantly turned to the Congress Socialist Party, and we will talk about why in a minute. But according to a study conducted by the U.S. Office of Strategic Services in India, there was little doubt that the Congress Socialist Party had been influenced by the principles of M.N. Roy. And many members of the Communist Party of India ended up joining the Congress Socialist Party, including Roy. However, even though they were ideologically similar and they were rooted in Marxism, tension was rife between the two groups, particularly because of Roy's hostility toward the party. He regarded the CSP as, quote, a vague, heterogeneous national movement. And according to a CPI member, the conflict was a result of fundamentally different approaches to the independence movement and its activism. Quote, the Congress Socialists were critical of the Congress leadership but failed to give any militant leadership to the fighting people. The CPI, on the contrary, came out with what was called the Proletarian Path, a program of organizing and leading militant struggles of the working people on the living problems of their life, which were being made more and more unbearable, and turning these struggles into a revolutionary upheaval. Inevitably, the falling out occurred in 1937 when Roy had instructed his followers to begin resigning from the Congress Socialist Parties, essentially in hopes of witnessing the CSP collapse. And they listened and they did. And upon reflecting on the incident, Jayaprakash Narayan had written, quote, after more than a year and a half of close cooperation, our Royist friends left us with a parting kick. The entire responsibility for disrupting the measure of unity that had been achieved must be laid at the door of the Royists and above all of Sri Roy. This brings us to why the Communist Party and the Socialist Party were even trying to collaborate in the first place, and I think you can kind of infer a little bit, but it was the empire. And that kind of brings us to our second point about leadership in the party. And first we should start by pointing out a general problem that isn't necessarily the fault of the empire, and that's that the base of these left-wing parties were unreliable. And especially when we look at agrarian sectors of the population, that sector isn't necessarily focused on longevity and long-term ambitions and goals, and really their agitation is kind of contingent on their individual circumstances. So if they don't have food to eat, they are ready to fight. But if they can feed themselves and they can feed their family, they don't really see the need to compromise on that stability. And this ends up being more of a problem for the Communist Party than the Congress Socialist Party, because the Communist Party is more of a grassroots organization. And I would argue that they were also perceived as more of a threat to the empire. But do not mistake me for a second, the empire did not like the Congress Socialist Party, especially after their literal guerrilla warfare campaign that they launched against the Raj during the Quit India movement. So back to the Communist Party. Already we've established that they are at a real disadvantage because their base is unreliable. And within that base, there aren't really that many people that are willing to take on a leadership role in the party. So even though we have someone as prominent as M.N. Roy at the very top, the individual chapters throughout India are very weak and very inconsistent, especially when it comes to this issue over land tenure and ownership. And what exacerbates that is this relentless campaign spearheaded by the British government to stamp out any and all traces of communism throughout India, which is really not that surprising when you think about Britain's involvement in the Russian Revolution as well as Churchill's stance on communism. Almost as quickly as the Communist Party of India had begun, the British government had subjected it to trial after trial in an effort to shut it down. There was the Peshawar conspiracy case in 1922, the Kanpur Bolshevik conspiracy case in 1924, and the Meerut conspiracy case in 1929. And consequently, these trials were avenues for the British government to amend and pass several repressive measures in India, which included Section 121A and 124 of the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1908, the Third Regulation of 1818, and the Foreigners Act of 1864, as well as provisions for detention under certain provincial enactment. And not only did these measures allow the Raj to raid private homes and spaces and arrest and detain leaders, as well as any suspects presumed to be involved in left-wing organizations and activities, but it also allowed them to outlaw the Communist Party altogether, which was a huge blow to the organizing and rallying strategies, as well as kind of losing all the leadership that was effective in the first place. So as you might expect, this crackdown is what brought the Communist Party and the Socialist Party together. And by now, I'm sure you're like, okay, I have all this information, and Nikki, you still haven't answered the question, what does all of this mean in relation to Britain's global history? And I was asking myself the same question, and I have come to two conclusions based on all my reading. One, that radicalism in India during the independence movement can be seen as not only a prelude, but kind of a microcosm for Britain's position in the imminent Cold War. And two, the much more compelling point, I think, is that deliberate or not, Britain's crusade against the Communist Party of India contributed to their ability to maintain their holding of India as a colony. And because in addition to the cultural and religious schisms that already existed in India, this added kind of another ideological complication that further prevented the formation of a unified India. Thank you so much for watching. I hope all of that made sense. And there was so much material that I wanted to touch on because I encountered just so much interesting stuff in my reading that I just couldn't get to in the time that we had. You know, there's Nehru's position in all of this and how he sort of identifies as a socialist but kind of sticks with the INC, and Gandhi. There's the relationship that the CPI and the CSP had with the Muslim League. There's the Communist Party's role in Quit India, or lack thereof really, and I mean, what happens when Russia enters the World War II and becomes an ally with Britain, and how this ban on being a communist is suddenly lifted. And I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff that I wanted to touch on, but I just couldn't. So anyway, thank you for watching, and